We all know French's for their mustard, but you'll be surprised some of the stuff that French's was known for up until recent history, like parakeet food. Let's learn the French's story today on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. Robert Timothy French was born in 1828 in New York, and he moved to New York City as a child. For some years, he worked as a salesman for the wholesale dealer S.M. Beard, Son & Company, which we see was a spice coffee type of store. It seems that he moves from salesman to crockery. The first record we find for him is in 1867 in New York City in crockery. In 1870, he confirms that he's still in crockery. Let's look at his household. He's married to Frances. They have 3 of their 4 boys, George, Robert Jr., and Francis, and they end up having Edward the following year. In 1875, he's a merchant now, so he's finally started his own business. He's 47 now. The directory says that he's into coffees on Front Street. 4 years later, he's at the same location in New York City, listed under spices. By 1880, he's listed under tea merchant, but the directory that same year says that he's listed under mustard, which is when history says that he started the mustard business. He even changed locations to Reed Street, still in New York City. According to his obituary, he came to Rochester in 1883, but I don't see him show up in the directory until 1885. He's in business with a guy named John G. Palmer and his oldest son George, and their firm is called French, Palmer & French. Although their ad in the back of the phone book says Pure Gold Manufacturing Company. It continues to say wholesale dealers in pure gold baking powder, cream of tartar, soda, saleratus, which I had to look up. It's a leavening agent, kind of like baking soda, mustard, etc. It says importers and grinders of fine spices, proprietors of famous pure gold Java coffee, the best coffee in the world. So I learned that his son George would sometimes make trips to Chicago and then stop in Rochester on his way home. It was during one of these trips that he learned that the company Pure Gold Manufacturing was for sale. So that's how they ended up buying this business. And Robert French is the president of this firm. Now 5 years later, they're still going strong. They're still conducting business at Brown's Race at the foot of Furnace, which could be one of these buildings. But I saw a description that it was a 6-story building, and this one's only 5. So this building might not be here anymore. So we know that the oldest boy, George, is working with his dad. His other son, Robert Jr., is a physician. And in this 1891 newspaper, it lists some salaries. It seems the monthly salary of a physician in 1891 is $41.66. We won't really need to talk about him anymore after this because he's not part of the family business. We also see in 1891 that Edward, the youngest, is listed at Harvard University, and also notes that 2 of his other brothers are also alumni and what year they graduated. Edward ends up becoming a physician, so we won't really need to talk about him anymore after this either. So here in 1891, French, Palmer & French are still listed, but then in 1892, we see it called Robert T. French Company. And that guy, John Palmer, he's moved on to another business endeavor called Brown & Palmer. So there's one brother we still have to talk about, and we see in 1892, Francis joined his dad and brother in the Robert T. French Company. Here are some 1892 ads in the paper reflecting the new name. This all happened just in time because in June of the following year, Robert had caught the flu and he remained ill for about 2 months before dying at the age of 64. It mentions his home address at 213 Alexander Street, and if the numbering is the same, it would probably be where this Dunkin' Donuts is, but you can see the style of the houses next door. The following year, in 1894, we see George taking over as president. Francis is a salesman there. Edward is a student. Robert Jr. is still a doctor. But I thought it was interesting to note that 3 of the 4 boys still live with their newly widowed mom. In 1900, we learn that George has married Julia and they have a daughter named Julia. And at this point, French's company is selling spices, coffees, and mustards. Here's an ad in the paper for French's pepper. In February 1900, a small fire made papers. It affected the second floor. It started to go onto the third floor, but it was put out quickly, and they noted that the fireman looked like a yellow jacket because he was covered in mustard. I'm assuming mustard powder. It only caused about $200 to $300 worth of damage. Throughout the years, I found many wanted ads for positions for the plant. I found this one interesting because there was actually a section in the paper looking for girls for work and a separate section of the wanted ads for men. In 1904, George is selling his parents' house on Alexander Street. He mentions here that it's a brick house. He's asking $7,000 for it. His mom is still alive, so I don't know where she's living. 1904 is also a very important year for this company. See, back in those days, mustard was very hot and spicy. The boys had been working on a more mild, creamier version of mustard, and in 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair had millions of people there, and George and Frances took their new mild mustard and happened to give out samples on hot dogs, which I learned Franks were around for a while by then. But just recently, the hot dog bun was thought of. So this expo not only catapulted the popularity of the hot dog, but also French's mustard. There were many other food items that were catapulted during that expo, like hamburgers, ice cream cones, and cotton candy. French's cream salad mustard sales skyrocketed, and by 1910 they had to build a bigger plant to keep up with the demand. This article talks about some of the details of the new design. It says the business is among the largest mustard and spice manufacturers in the United States. One thing that it says is that part of the building will be 3 stories high, affording space for the mustard department, which requires the enormous amount of 8 tons of mustard seed for its daily activities. Adjoining this department will be the spice rooms, and it mentions that they import spices from every point in the Orient, as well as from the east coast of Africa. It says in their current plant, they use water to power the plant, and this new plant will use electricity. While we're in 1910, I wanted to mention that out of the 4 brothers, only 2 of them had children, George and Frances, and they only had daughters. So there are no sons to take over the business at this point. I found this 1914 ad interesting. Here's a furniture store advertising that if you bought a refrigerator or a cabinet, that they would come stocked with foods, and they mentioned some of French's products in there. Now, up until a certain point, mustard was sold in powder form, and you were to take it home and you add water yourself. Around 1915, French's had an idea that maybe we can sell it already prepared, and they put it into glass jars. Here's a look at the packing line in 1917. I thought this 1920 ad was pretty funny. It says, "We have openings for girls or women who like machine work. We can give you steady work all year round if you're a steady worker, and don't feel that because you are earning a good pay, you can afford to lay off a day or 2 each week. Saturday afternoons off all year." So I wonder if that means you have to work Sundays. Here's a 1924 newspaper ad that shows that their jar design is the same as the one from 1915. This is also my jar design. My jar has a patent date of 1915 on the bottom. It's machine made, but it also has a few air bubbles in it and some imperfections that make it look like it's blown. I would probably say my bottle is in between that time, between 1915 and probably the time of this ad, maybe 1924. And the packaging would have looked like this. It came in a box, and it comes with a little wooden mustard spreader. It says, "with sanitary paddle." Here's another ad in 1924. It's for mayonnaise. Interesting. In August 1924, they needed more room again, so they built an office building and they added a small street on their property, and they're the only ones on this street. They jokingly called it 1 Mustard Street, but it stuck and it became their official address. And at this point, they are advertising nationally. 2 years later, at the end of 1926, George French, the oldest brother, he dies at the age of 72. He had been president of this company for 37 years. He's actually 14 years older than Francis, so Francis is about 58 now, and he takes over as president. This same year, J&J Coleman, it's an English firm who manufactures Coleman's mustard, they acquire interest in French's company, which gives French's a wider scope of customers. In 1932, they introduced Hot Dan the Mustard Man. They made Hot Dan mustard spoons and attached them to the package. They were very popular and would constantly get requests for them to be mailed. Mothers found that this spoon was the perfect size for baby food. Hot Dan was phased out in the 1950s. Now here's another ad. I see so many of these old ads where husbands are getting mad at their wives over food. I guess husbands have just always been brats. In 1944, these ads are interesting. The top ad is for a full-time, which is 53 hours a week. The bottom ad is for part-time work from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. I learned that this shift was called the housewives shift. The housewives would wait till their husbands came home from work and then they went to work. Apparently this was very common during this time. In 1945, Francis died at the age of 77. He had been president for about 17 years. After this, no one from the French family is involved with the business anymore. A guy named John Crockcroft from England took over as president. Now here's the plant in 1949. It shows a lady working the pepper production line, to which the photographer complained that he kept having to sneeze. But this lady's used to it. This other lady is pouring caps into the capping machine, which will automatically be screwed onto the jars. This article mentions that one of French's more recent additions is French's Instant Potatoes, which was developed in England during the war to serve the armed forces. French's started manufacturing it and brought a British Navy Lieutenant Commander William Hughes to come in and be in charge of making it. French's had a girls' sharpshooter team in 1949. In 1951, all 300 employees walk out about 10 a.m. on June 18th. Well, the Friday before that, 25 employees had been laid off, and then 3 more were just let go. The president of the company said that he let them go because they refused to work, but the employees said that they were working in unsafe conditions, namely having to push tubs of potato powder which weigh more than a half a ton fully loaded, and that such a weight is unsafe for one man, and that no worker should be required to work under these unsafe conditions. Negotiations are still going on July 3rd, so that's 2 weeks so far. In this July article, it says that there's 350 employees that walked out. The other one said it was 300. Anyways, they'll all be getting a bonus, and they'll be splitting $110,000 based on their earnings from the last year. And if it had been split evenly between all 350 employees, it would be about $314 each. It doesn't really talk about any of the other terms that were part of the negotiations, but we see in September that year a dinner is held for employees that have been with the company for more than 25 years or more, and a few in particular had been with the company for 40 plus years, including some retired employees, and they had been recognized for their service. In October of that year, Crockcroft decided to move the potato processing to Idaho, which makes sense. In 1953, French's buys a 46,000 square foot building from a company next door to expand their property. So we haven't talked about the birdseed thing yet. French's sold other pet supplies as well since about 1905. The oldest brother, George French, actually bred and raised birds, mostly canaries, and he just decided to put a quality birdseed together for sale. George actually published a pamphlet about bird care, and he invited people to write in with any questions. Well, here in this 1953 article, it talks about the sudden popularity in parakeets. Apparently, they would receive about 10,000 letters a year regarding pet care, but this year, it's been about 5,000 letters a day, the majority asking about parakeet care. I thought that was pretty interesting, that in the early 1950s that parakeets were so popular. This 1956 article says that French's is the world's largest canary and parakeet seed producer. They said that during the Depression, the birdseed was the company's best seller and actually kept the company afloat. They eventually dropped the birdseed line in 1975. Now this article shows a small photo of the French's plant. I looked up Mustard Street, and this is what the building looks like now. In 1958, this article says that last year they built a huge French's plant in Philadelphia, about the same size as this one. And they just rolled out a new product, a new spaghetti sauce, that they've been working on for 4 years on perfecting. During the 50s and 60s, more than half of the country's mustard was produced here at Rochester. Here's another look at the inner workings of the plant in 1966. By this time, they're sending out hundreds of thousands of recipe books every year, and in the paper for every holiday, there are holiday recipes to try. In 1966, this article states that French's employees will be getting about 2 weeks' pay as a bonus, and that includes the ones in Idaho and Philadelphia, over 1,300 people. In 1968, Crockcroft retired after 23 years as president. It seems that after that, the company changes presidents about every 5 years or so. Here's a look inside the plant in 1971. This 1980 100th anniversary article explains that the production stopped at this plant in Rochester in 1972 due to an outdated facility, costing more than 500 people their jobs. The only employees that remained was the headquarters and the test kitchen. The pleasant, spicy scent that permeated the air around Mustard Street soon faded, wrote Karen Dale. The company released hundreds of yellow balloons. Each one had the name of an employee and had a chance at a prize for the finder of the balloon and for the employee who was inside. Also, by their 100th anniversary, French's sold 500,000 jars of mustard a day. The English company, Reckitt and Coleman, is still mentioned as French's parent company. In 1985, French's sells the potato division to Pillsbury. In 1987, French merged with Durkee, which sells similar products. There are only about 200 employees still working in Rochester since the plant stopped processing back in 1972, but the headquarters are now moving to New Jersey, so French's has officially moved out for good. In 2000, there's a little note here about how former employees would get together every year for dinner. This 2011 article is really interesting. It's a story told from a guy who worked at French's when he was in high school. He said his mom worked there, so he applied, and he said he worked many different jobs, and he learned his way around. He said, "I started working as a hopper attendant, which meant that I had to lift and dump 100-pound burlap bags of mustard seed into a large hopper. These seeds were sent down a conveyor to the floor below, where it was crushed into powder. I had homework to do while I was dumping these heavy bags, so I developed a system to allow extra time in between. I called this my work smarter, not harder phase. I would stack the bags on top of each other and tear a small opening in each bag. I would stack 10 to 15 bags, and then I would have an extra 10 to 15 minutes to do some homework. On the floor below, the seeds were crushed and separated into oil, husk, and powder. On the bottom floor, the mustard was mixed with vinegar and spices. Over where the yellow mustard powder was collected, you could get a rash if your skin touched the powder. At the beginning of everyone's shift, everyone would lather up with a lanolin-based product and put on protective gloves. One time, I wanted to spend a little extra time with my girlfriend, so I devised a plan to accidentally allow some mustard to touch my arm, and then I went to the school nurse who told me, "You better stay home a few days until that rash goes away." Now, as far as the Rochester factory goes, well, many of the buildings were demolished. The rest of the buildings are being used by Hillside Family of Agencies now, which is a family support agency. And that's going to do it for today. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.